Now that our server is in a good place, we're going to shift gears a little bit and start working on our MCP client. The client can be found inside the MCP client.py file inside the root project directory. Now, before we do anything inside this file, I just want to give you a very quick reminder here. Remember what I told you about earlier. Usually in a typical project, we are either making use of a client or we are implementing a server. It's just in this one particular project that we're working on that we are doing both. Again, just so you can see both sides of the puzzle. Now, the MCP client itself inside of this file is consisting of a single class. You'll notice there's a lot of code inside of here, and it doesn't look quite as pretty as some of the code we just wrote out inside of the server. So let me tell you exactly what's going on inside this file and exactly why it is so large. Okay, so inside this file, we are making the MCP client class. This class is going to wrap up something called a client session. The client session is the actual connection to our MCP server. This client session is a part of the MCP Python SDK. So again, this session is what gives us this connection to the outside server. The session itself requires a little bit of resource cleanup. In other words, whenever we close down our program or decide that we don't need the server anymore, we have to go through a little bit of a cleanup process. And I have already written out a lot of that cleanup code inside of the MCP client class. So that's really why this class exists at all, just to make that cleanup a little bit easier. You can see some of that cleanup code inside of the connect function, and down a little bit lower at the cleanup, async enter, and async exit functions as well. So it's very common practice to not just make use of this client session directly. Instead, very common to wrap it up inside of a larger class that's going to manage some of this different resource stuff for you. The next thing I want to clarify is why this client exists at all. So in other words, what is the client really doing for us here? Well, remember this flow that we looked at a little bit ago. So we had our code right here, and at certain points in time, we needed, say, a list of tools to send off to Claude. And then later on after that, we also needed to run a tool that was requested by Claude. In order to reach out to our MCP server and get this list of tools or to run a tool, that's where we are making use of the MCP client. So we can imagine that this client is exposing some functionality that belongs to the server to the rest of our codebase. So inside of our codebase, inside this project, specifically inside of the core directory, there is a lot of code already inside there that I put together that is making use of this class. So there's some other code that's going to call some of the different functions you see inside of here, like list tools, call tool, list prompts, get prompt, and so on. For right now, in this video, we're going to focus on implementing two functions, list tools and call tool. So as you just saw in the diagram we looked at a moment ago, these two functions are going to be used in different parts of our code base to get a list of tools to provide off to Claude, and then eventually call a tool whenever Claude requests to call a tool. Implementing these two functions is going to be really simple and straightforward. So let me show you how we're going to do it. We'll first begin with list tools. I'm going to remove the to-do inside there and replace it with result is await self.session. I'm going to call that like a function, list underscore tools, and then I will return result.tools. And that's it. So this is going to get access to our session, which is our actual connection to the MCP server. It's going to call a built-in function to get a definition or a list of all the different tools that are implemented by that server. I'm going to get back a result and then just return the tools, and that's it. Then we can implement call tool right here in a very similar fashion. So this will be return await self.session, call tool, tool name, and tool input. Once again, getting access to the session, that is our connection to the server, and I'm going to attempt to call a very specific tool. The name of the tool will be passed in along with the input parameters or input arguments to it that were provided by Claude. Now at this point in time, I would like to test out these two functions really quickly. To do so, we're going to go down to the bottom of this file where I put together a very small testing harness for us. So down here, you'll notice I put together this testing block. So we can run this MCP client.py file directly. And if we do so, we're going to form a connection to our MCP server, and then we can just run some commands against it and just see what we get back. Notice that in your version of the code, there's a comment in there about changing the command in args right here in case you are not making use of UV. So if you're not using UV, make sure you take a look at that comment. Inside of this with block, I'm going to add in a little bit of testing code. So I'll say result is await underscore client list tools, and then I'm going to just print out the result that we get back. So this should start up a copy of our MCP server, then attempt to get a list of all the different tools that are defined by it, and then just print out the result. To test this out, I will flip back over to my terminal and do a UV run mcp underscore client.py. And as usual, if you are not making use of UV, you'll just do a Python mcp client.py. Okay, so I'll run that. And there is our list of tool definitions. So I can see inside of here that I have the read doc contents tool, which we put together a little bit ago, and our edit document tool as well. Each one has a description and a input schema as well. So this is our tool definition, which will eventually be passed off to Claude. Now, before we move on, there's one other thing I want to test. Remember, we just implemented the function that's going to allow us to list out some tools and pass them off to Claude, and the function that's going to allow us to call a tool that is implemented by the MCP server and then pass the result off to Claude as well. I have already implemented the code that is going to call list tools and call tool for us somewhere else inside this project. So now that we have added in this functionality, now that we have defined these tools and the ability to call a particular tool, we can now run our CLI again and attempt to get Claude to make use of these tools. In other words, we can ask Claude to inspect the contents of some particular document and even edit a document. So let me show you how we do that. Inside of my MCP server, I just want to give you a reminder that there is a document with an ID of report.pdf, and it has some text here of something like a 20-meter condenser tower. I'm going to go back over to my terminal, and I'm going to run my project with a UV run main.py, and then I'm going to ask Claude what is the contents of the report.pdf document. And make sure you put in exactly report.pdf here. And when we run this, we're sending off, along with the request, our list of tools. Claude is going to decide to use the read document tool, and it's going to get the contents of the document, and then we will see that, yes, Claude was able to get the contents of that document. We are told that the report is something about a 20-meter condenser tower. All right, so at this point, we have added in some functionality around our client. Remember, the client is what allows us to access some functionality that is implemented inside of the MCP server. At this point in time, we have been able to list out some tools that are created by the server and execute a tool that has been implemented by the server.